Hello, everyone. I'm here today with Wanda Walker, whom I have the pleasure to introduce. Wanda is the author of several novels belonging to the genres ranging from contemporary fiction to low fantasy, focused on realistic portrayals of characters and social attitudes. She is also an illustrator, currently publishing a webcomic on Tapas called Rainbow Mansion. Today, we are discussing her approach to fantasy applied to her three-volume novel, The Duke's Prisoner, written back in 2012. So, Wanda, my first question for you is, what is your approach to fantasy? How do you build your world, and does it have any supernatural elements involved?
Well, thank you for bringing me on and interviewing me, first of all. Second of all, what is my approach to fantasy? So I'm kind of, I guess it would be like an anthropological approach more than like a standard fantasy, because I don't tend to put much magic or any magic at all. Um, Whereas I really like to build societal structures and societal norms and how characters interact with them, especially revolving sometimes around gender, and social hierarchies, class, and people will say, well, you could probably just do historical fiction, and I'm like, I'm not much of a historian, not much of a researcher. I would get things wrong and then I would feel horrible about them. So it's a lot more interesting for me to create those societies, especially because typically how I create stories is there's a certain dynamic that I find interesting, and then I'm like, how do I create a society in which this dynamic is possible? Um, so with the Duke's Prisoner, it was kind of like, I really like Rococo fashion. Like, I love the big wigs and the big hair and the bows and all that kind of crazy stuff. But there were like some things that I don't know much about the period beyond that. So I was like, well, I'll just create something that can have that aesthetic that I love so much, but also have this plot that wouldn't be possible probably in the historical context. So how do I create society that appeals to the aesthetic while also appealing to my desire to have this certain kind of plot and character dynamic? So the Duke's Prisoner doesn't really have supernatural elements beyond their ability to travel real fast. Because I'm like, I don't want to spend them like 6 months in the mountains. That's not interesting to me. So things are probably a little bit closer together in my worlds than they would be in history. So but there's no other magic or anything like that. There are no creatures. They all have horses because I love horses and I love writing about horses. So I would say my approach to fantasy is more approaching it from an anthropological sort of, how can I create this character dynamic plus this societal thing that I want, which in this case was just like, I want their big hats. I want their big wigs. So, and I wanted like a dandy kind of character. And so I thought, okay, well, then he has to be a duke and he has to be super rich and also like sort of eccentric and, that sort of thing. So yeah, that's how I go about it.
Yeah, this is interesting. So is the world that you create better or worse than reality? Because I saw that in fantasy, it is often people tend to go to extremes. Like some of them make this super dark world, like, I don't know, Game of Thrones, where they pour everything that is wrong with society and more. And other people tend, on the other hand, to compensate, like make a kind of world where there is no, I don't know, discrimination and things like that, to compensate for the bad things that happen in our world. How would you say yours is compared to this?
Well, history is pretty dark, so I don't want to say it's like darker than history. I do tend to go pretty dark more often than not. Specifically because I like exploring oppressive societal structures. It's what I find interesting. I know there's a lot of people who are like, if I go to a fantasy world, I don't want to have to worry about these sort of things. And I understand that, and I'm totally supportive of their desire to like, get away from it. I personally also use the example of like me being a woman. I relate more to female characters who deal with the kind of stuff that women have to deal with. So I prefer to read stories about women fighting against these oppressive structures. It's just more interesting and relatable to me. So I do tend to create, a hierarchy and people fighting against the hierarchy or fighting each other in the hierarchy. And I do tend to go darker. It's just, I don't know why. I just kind of like dark stories. I think for me, it's definitely about characters overcoming adversity, like extreme adversity, and kind of taking them to their brink and then seeing how they deal with it and the way different people will deal with certain traumas. That's just super interesting for me to explore. So I'm not opposed to like more positive portrayals of fantasy, but especially with the Duke's Prisoner was pretty dark. So it's just kind of like for me, like writing is just a way of exploring kind of disturbing stuff in a safe environment, which I think is what a lot of people use fiction for. You can go and explore this stuff and then you can still emerge and be like, okay, everything's fine. But yeah.
Okay, I see. Yeah, that makes sense. So, why have you chosen this approach without anything supernatural? So, I mean, what are the advantages and the disadvantages of it?
The advantages are I don't have to sit around and come up with lore. I don't have to think about the rules. I'm just thinking of a novel now that does involve magic, and there's a lot of different things you have to think about and contingencies and what works, what doesn't, why doesn't it work, not making things too powerful because it's too powerful, it's not interesting. It's just like a way of avoiding too much world building, because you can really get bogged down with just world building, and a lot of the time it never even comes up. I remember, I think it was back in, I don't know when it was a thing, but people used to have all these like questionnaires you would fill out for like, oh, what is your character's hair color and their height and what candy do they like and all these sort of things. And that reminds me of like getting bogged down with stuff that doesn't really matter. So to me, what really matters to me is character journeys, and magic doesn't really help much with character journeys. Maybe there are some characters that are really informed, like struggling to deal with magic or dragons or any of that sort of stuff. But my characters really don't need those sorts of things to grow and change and learn. So it's kind of just a way of like shedding off stuff that I don't think would do this story much service. And disadvantages are you have to deal with how life like like if someone's bleeding out in the mountains, you can't just have like a magician show up and be like, okay, you're healed. Like they have to have that injury for 2 weeks or whatever. They got to deal with that. Like I said, travel is also a thing. Like how fast can someone walk up a mountain? Not that fast. So you have to write a lot of scenes of people just like hanging out in the mountains eating squirrels or whatever. And so and some people really like the world building. They like being able to go to worlds where things are really, they like learning about all this sort of information. And I guess my stories wouldn't be for that kind of person who's super anal about details, because I'm kind of loosey goosey with a lot of that stuff, because I just kind of like write, and I don't do a lot of formatting and outlining and all that sort of stuff. I often tell people like the reason I'm able to finish books is because I don't know exactly what's going to happen. And if I plot it all out perfectly, then I won't write the books. I'm like, well, I already know what happens, so that's that. So there has to, I mean, I generally know where it's going and I know like what the end will be, but I don't know all the details in between. So being able to not have to do all the lore work and everything like that kind of is also an advantage in that I can get a little, the details don't have to be hammered out until I get there. Just so that I'm surprised when I get to certain things and I'm like, huh, okay, well that was good. It feels very organic to me. Like I just write until something happens. And as I get closer to that scene, it gets a little bit more beefed up in my mind. But once I'm 20 pages in, I usually have very little, like I just have a vague understanding of what's going to happen at page 300. So the not having magic is an advantage in that way. But the disadvantage is it's not as structured as it probably would be if I had to think all this stuff out. So.
Right. So you first decide the premise and then you just start writing. You know where you have to get, but a lot of the stages you just discover as you go, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is really good because you're definitely a prolific writer. You have a lot of stories, a lot of finished stories, which is something that a lot of writers struggle with. So yeah, so definitely your approach has worked so far. So that's good.
Yeah.
Could you tell us more about the Duke's Prisoner in terms of premise and plot?
So the Duke's Prisoner is he is the nephew of the king. He is a duke, but he's seen as like eccentric and weird. So like none of his family cares for him much, and he knows it. And so he's just kind of like hangs out in his big house with his wife, and he has a son. But he's also gay, so his wife is like his best friend basically, and they've done enough to have the child, but for most part they're just friends. And then he has collected this group of friends who are like eccentric and kind of outcasts from society, and they have lots of parties and they have a lot of fun. So it's kind of like a contrast because he has this pretty privileged life and it's very quite glamorous until so he has he goes to the king and asks if he can. They're also at war. There's Kasha is in the nation of Denali, and they are at war with the nation of Malark, which is north, and their cultures are very different. And Kasha has heard word that was in love with this soldier who went off to war, and the soldier came back that he had been killed. Kasha had reason to believe that this certain man had killed Abele, his lover, and so he asked the king if he can provide the person he believes killed Abele to him, so that he can kind of keep him as his prisoner because he's super mad and wants revenge for that this man had killed his lover. So the king gives him the guy, this Malarkan soldier that Kasha believes killed Abele, and Kasha kind of takes him prisoner and keeps him in his house and does some not great things to him, like denying him sleep, denying him food unless he acts the way that, like, particularly respectful, which knowing the soldier from Malark is not particularly respectful of Kasha because he thinks Kasha is like this stupid rich boy who doesn't understand real life, and Kasha doesn't understand this Malarkan guy named Rodan because he thinks like this guy is just an idiot. He's like super stern and super just he doesn't seem particularly smart either. So they have a lot of clashes. So that's kind of the premise of the story, is Kasha trying to battling with who he thinks he is, as he's like this very generous person who takes care of all of his friends and has these fantastic parties and is not judgmental or whatever. And then his deep desire for revenge against this person who he thinks brutally murdered the love of his life, and how he kind of struggles to um, split himself apart in a way that he can get revenge against this person, when he is also like not the kind of person who is violent or has these violent tendencies, but he's just so distraught and in deep grief over the death of Abele. So that's basically the premise of the story. Sorry, that was kind of all over the place, but
So we can see even from this that Kasha is a complex character, because on the one hand we see him as this family guy who is really warm and loves life, and on the other hand we see him as a man who wants to take revenge.
mhm,
So he's a protagonist full of surprises and with an
mhm.
interesting character arc. So can you tell us more about his backstory,
Yeah, so
personality in general?
yeah, he was born into very privileged society. His mom kind of went to a nunnery because she was super religious and didn't like his father, because his father constantly cheated on her with all kinds of women. So she was like, okay, I'm leaving to the nunnery with me. And then Kasha's father died after he'd done had these affairs. He wasn't close with his father either. So Kasha's childhood was pretty lonely. He didn't get a lot of love from his parents, and then all of his relatives who came from like royal family or descendants of the royal family. They did not treat him well. He was kind of seen as like this skinny little annoying boy who was effeminate, and there was some abuse that had happened to him from his older sibling, or not siblings, his older relatives, and it kind of, he decided like he hated his family, he hated the society, like posh proper society. He had no interest in their approval, so he was basically kind of hold himself off and was like, okay, well, I'm only going to waste my time on people who actually care about me. So he found his wife, who was actually a prostitute at the city where he went to university, and they hit it off really well. So he decided, I need to marry a woman for obvious reasons, to continue the family line. So I might as well marry this woman. I put her in there because often I find a lot of these movies with like societies that aren't particularly open to like homosexuality or whatever, they kind of, if they do have to get married to a woman, it's like this really contentious sort of relationship. And I like to have female characters that are like enjoyable and that have strong friendships with the protagonist. So it was kind of like, okay, he has to get married, and if he has to get married, I would really like him to get married to someone who's like a cool person, who totally understands him. So that's why they have such a strong friendship, strong bond. They love each other in like a platonic way. She has her relationships, he has his, it's totally fine. His family wasn't enthused about the relationship, but she is a woman, so they're like, well, that's more than we expected. So yeah, and then after he had his child, he's very involved in his son's life, and he's a pretty good family man who loves his wife. They hang out, they have parties, they get along great. And then he's created all these friendships with people like other gay people, other queer people, other kind of people who've been thrown out from proper society. He doesn't like to hang out with boring people. Um, he likes to have parties and just have a good time. And then, of course, then he meets Bele, who, he's always had relationships, but they've been kind of like fun flings. He's not super involved in a lot of them, but he meets Abele and falls like deeply in love with him, and then loses him. So that kind of upends his whole world, because it's like the one person he's been totally in love with, and then he loses him, and it just kind of like breaks him. So his wife has helped him a lot too, in helping him get his you know, because he's in the deep throes of depression, she kind of helps lift him out of that. So yeah, that's his backstory. He's super interesting character just because I love like the foppish kind of over the top. I really do like to have more feminine male characters. I really like that kind of contrast between the two. Also because like the fashion, I just love the fashion. So yeah, but he's also he portrays himself as very kind of shallow and, oh, I just want to have fun, I want to get drunk and have a good time, but he is also like a deeply emotional person. He doesn't want to admit it, but with Opheali, he's realizing like, oh, I do feel like deeply terrified of losing this person. So that's why when he does lose him, it's like it kind of breaks him. So
Would you say that the way he presents himself, is it an act, or is it a way to be rebellious against the societal norms that were imposed upon him growing up, or is it, I don't know, maybe a fear that he will never find someone that he really loves until he meets a ballet?
I do think it was a bit of a rebellion, like, I'm going to be the most ridiculous person because that's who everyone thinks I am. So I'm going to like embrace it and just go buck wild, you know? So he kind of, it's kind of an act some of the time, in how he'd like, oh, I don't care about what people think of me. I'm just this eccentric person, and you know, you either like it or you can away with you, or whatever. And I think, especially with his interactions with Rodan, he's kind of forced to realize like he's not this ridiculous person that everyone has kind of assumed he is. Like, he has the ability to harm people in the same way he's been harmed. And he can be really hurt because he's been hurt for a lot of his life by his family, and he kind of just pretends that it hasn't hurt him in the way it has. And I think when Opheali died, it was kind of like, oh, he can't pretend he doesn't feel pain anymore. You know, he has to truly, it's just kind of like all the pain up until then, that's the thing that just kind of like breaks the dam, and it all comes rushing out, and he turns into this person that he never thought he was capable of becoming. And, you know, eventually comes to really regret a lot of the things that he did. And I think he starts to understand why certain people may act the way that they do, because anyone can be taken to that point. So yeah, he's kind of an interesting character because on one hand, he's like really ridiculous and funny. And then also on the other hand, he's capable of a lot more anger, rage, and he can make people hurt in ways that he always thought was like resented because other people would hurt him. So yeah.
Exactly. So, would you say that well, does he force himself to intimidate Rodan, or does it come to him naturally because it unleashes a part of himself that he never knew existed?
I think it's a bit of both. I think he wants to inspire fear in Rodan because he wants him to feel the pain that he either inflicted on Opheali and on Kasha. But he doesn't really know how to get respect out of people because he's never been in a position where anyone's respected him outside of like maybe like the people in his estate, or you know, his estate. He knows how to win respect via kindness because a lot of his servants, he has good relationships with them. But he's never known how to command respect via violence. So I think he struggles because Rodan just kind of thinks he's like ridiculous. He's like, this is a man who's like gone through war. He's dealt with all kinds of like terrible people and seen terrible things. And here's this like man with crazy hair and like stockings and all like a fancy cravat and everything, like trying to threaten him. And so he's kind of like, you're a ridiculous person. Please go away. And got pissed off because Kasha's like, No, I'm trying to like, I'm so pissed at you right now. Like, I want you to die. I want you to feel pain. And you're just thinking I'm this ridiculous person. So I think there's that kind of dynamic and that, like, how Kasha wants to be perceived and how he's actually being perceived.
Definitely, definitely. These two characters, the protagonist and the antagonist, they are so opposite, and they have to learn how to deal with each other and how to understand each other, at least each other's motivations and personality. And I think that they both are mistaken in the way that they perceive each other in the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, because I think especially once Kasha sees more of who Rodan is, I think there's more, like, I think Kasha kind of gets more understanding of Rodan before Rodan is like willing to understand Kasha. But once they like go on this particular journey in the mountains, it's kind of like, okay, Kasha's completely out of his element. He's like, having to eat squirrels. Like, what is this? And he deals with it a lot better than like Rodan expected that he would. So I think once Rodan sees, oh, this guy is capable of surviving on his own, he's not this completely helpless person. There starts to be respect there, but I also think there's some mutual respect in that they both really, really care about their children and their families. Because I think once Kasha understands, oh, Rodan's the only thing he cares about, because he like will subject Rodan to anything, and Rodan's kind of like whatever. But then once he threatens his son, he's like, then Rodan's like, oh, maybe this is one thing that Kasha can use to get the respect, because Rodan really cares about his children, which Kasha also really cares about their children. So I think there's some mutual understanding and family, and also they're two gay men in societies. Kasha's is a little bit more accepting, and Rodan's is extremely not accepting, and kind of them having to deal with the tragedy of their struggle with that. So yeah.
Yes, definitely. Definitely. They also come from very different cultures, and this is another thing that sets them apart and another barrier in their comprehension of each other. So could you tell us more about the societies that they live in and maybe your inspiration? Well, you said a bit about the Rococo fashion, right? So could you elaborate a bit about the world building in the novel and these two main societies that you presented here, Denali and Malarkan?
Mm-hmm. So Denali was very loosely based on, like, I don't want to say Italy because the culture itself was like made up. The location I imagined as being very Italian. There's olive orchards. It's kind of dry, kind of warm. The it's like it's a kind of, obviously Italy has various temperatures, but I would put the Mediterranean kind of what's it called? The place where they're at is very kind of Mediterranean. Kasha goes to university by the sea. It's just kind of like a very warm kind of place, very idyllic. And then Malark is kind of, it's cold. It's a little hard. It's a lot harder to live there. It's in the mountains, and so the geography kind of influences how the cultures are and how the characters are. Kasha is this guy who can live in a nice warm place with plenty to eat, plenty of food, plenty to go around. Whereas Rodan's lived in a very harsh environment, so he's kind of a harsh person. He has learned how to deal with a bad hand. He's very able to survive in pretty much any kind of environment. So the geographies of where they are is kind of resembles them as characters as well. So, but I guess in regards, also saw the societies in the same way. Like Malark is kind of a hard place to live, and it created a hard society of people. And Rodan is a lot like them. And Kasha's where Kasha lives has created a people who are a little bit more loose, and or they're not as uptight about everything, and they can kind of party and have a good time. So it's all very interconnected.
Indeed, so they are both representatives of their societies, but at the same time, they both, or at least Kasha, still stands out in his society and doesn't really blend in because
Mhm.
they are more accepting than Malarkan society, but at the same time, they are still well judgmental of Kasha for a number of reasons.
Mhm.
So, but this warmer kind of atmosphere also relates to the fact that the country is much richer, right? Like you said,
Mhm.
and the life is easier. But uh,
Mhm.
the well, there are different kinds of people in both societies, both good and bad, and that, of course, very realistic and feels a lot like the real world. Also, they have different religions, right? One of them is polytheistic, and the other is monotheistic.
Mhm. Yeah.
Mm,
Yeah. It's just kind of like one is a region of plenty, and another is a region of harsh cold and elements and everything like that. And I think it might be more realistic to have like a punishing kind of vengeful god in a place where bad stuff happens all the time. And then much more frivolous kinds of, you know, gods when it comes to, uh, yeah, a place where they have plenty. I know I don't tend to get super bogged down in religion too in a lot of my books, just because I'm not like religion's not particularly interesting to me. So I often will bring it up and like the elements of religion. But I don't tend to get super into it. I'm recently writing a book right now where there is a character who has a lot more in it, and I have to create a lot of more lore, but it's kind of so I can borrow the aesthetics of some of a made up, it's not a real religion, more than it is that I can actually get into the theology of it. So I think with the Duke's Prisoner, I was pretty loosey-goosey with the details of the religion, because Kasha's obviously not religious at all. Rodan's obviously a lot more religious, but I think we get less of Rodan's head and more of Kasha's in the three parts. But um, yeah, my approach to religion in a lot of these fantasies is kind of like, well, it exists. My characters just tend not to be very religious, unless it's for a reason. Like Rodan is a like more strict person, from a more humble beginnings, so he struck me as someone who would be more religious.
mhm. Yeah, definitely. It makes a lot of sense that in Malark people would cling more to religion because the life is so difficult and they need um, some more to find comfort in something else and in a better world. So it
Mm-hmm.
really did make sense that there was more of religion in Rodan's part of the story, if I can call it like this. So
Mm-hmm.
in the part where they travel and when we get into his mind more than in Kasha's.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and especially, I mean, like his whole history, like they were at a monastery and what happened there. Um, you know, he's had more interaction, I think, with the religion than Kasha has. Because Kasha, and this is kind of like an example of what privilege can do for you. Like Kasha came from a very rich background. He can afford to just kind of like ignore everybody. You know, he can hold himself off in his estate and no one can touch him. He doesn't have to worry about, you know, heads of state, religions, or anyone coming for him because he has the ability to avoid them. Whereas Rodan really hasn't had that ability because he grew up pretty poor. So it kind of shows you how certain like religions or leaders or heads of states can manipulate your life based on where you are in it. Because I mean, in the book, Rodan is manipulated by people in power, and he has a deep distrust of powerful people because of that. So,
Is it also why he has a lot of misconceptions about Kasha in the beginning?
mhm,
Because he sees in Kasha uh, the worst of people in power, if we could say that.
yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah.
But even if they come from so different cultures, they still see that the other can be honorable, like you said, in especially in the family values that they both hold, right?
hmm
So
Yeah.
this is one common thing that they bond over in, well, to some extent.
hmm
Mm.
Yeah, for sure. And kind of see how they hold up in adversity. Obviously Rodan's used to adversity, so Kasha starts to accept Rodan more when he learns about the family bit, and I think Rodan starts to respect Kasha a bit when he sees how he deals with what Rodan deals with, like adversity, the hard temperatures and life that he's grown up with. I think once they see how the other has lived and and that sort of thing, they start to understand one another a bit more. Like I don't think they would have the same understanding if Kasha hadn't gone to Malark and seen and dealt with, oh, this is how this person has lived. And Rodan seeing how he reacts to that sort of harsh environment. So
Right, right, definitely. And of course, they begin on the wrong foot because of the, well, the circumstance of their meeting.
yeah.
So definitely, it's
Yeah.
only natural that they don't understand each other. So
hmm
the premise of the story is very strong because it puts the characters in sort of an extreme situation, and
hmm
it is difficult for both of them, and it tests both characters to their limits.
hmm
And this is also reflected in the structure of the novel. I found it interesting because well, it is full of surprises. So
hmm
well, I don't want to go a lot into the story, but I found the structure interesting. Could you tell us more a bit more about the way that you structure the story?
Yeah, so the first part is Kasha meeting Rodan, and then their whole like Kasha's mistreatment of Rodan, and Rodan kind of just being like, screw this guy. So there's that conflict. And then the second part is several years prior to this, and you get to see Kasha's relationship with the ballet, um, which I actually got comments on the story saying, you know, if I had read the second part first and had read the ending of the second part, which is that Abele is killed, I would have been so pissed off. But since they had come to the first part, they knew he was going to die. So I think if you bring a different understanding of the second part with you, you read all this story knowing how it ends. So there's a kind of like this sadness on, you're reading this really joyful moment and you're like, I know what's going to happen. Um, so there's that element. It was also a way of avoiding pissing people off because people really don't like it when you kill off love interest. But I thought it was important to show. I mean, there are other people saying like this part didn't even need to be here, but I thought it was important because I'm like, you never get to meet a ballet, and so his connection to a Kasha, you don't really. I'm like, okay, it's some guy that he loved, but you don't see like how the relationship actually played out. Um, until you read the second part. And I think that's a really important part of the story because you might better understand why Kasha is so angry at this person. If you didn't have that, you might be like, this guy, like Kasha's a total asshole. Like, and he does do horrible things. And I think it's important to recognize that. But you have a much richer understanding of, okay, if I had had this person in my life and how connected he was to Abele and how much in love with him he was, And then the third part is kind of a reaction to things that were learned in the first part. So you go from the present to the past, back to the present. And I think it's a good way to like saying, okay, all this is what all happened, and this is now they're actually going and doing something together, and you have the full story. And I also do go into Rodan's history in the third part, which we don't get. And that's also an important element of understanding why Rodan is the way he is. And I think it's both of their backstories are really important to understand to kind of get to know why they are the way they are, and why like how Rodan could like possibly forgive Kasha for what he did, because he does get to see all the stuff that Kasha's going through. It gives him a deeper understanding. So I just think I mean, I do really like writing romance stories. So the second part was a lot of fun for me because it was like very overwrought, which I love to do. So, I mean, there are people who wouldn't like the structure, and that's fine. I mean, people don't have to like it. There are parts of it that I don't particularly like because, yeah, you read the whole thing and you're like, great for them, but I know how it ends. So people might be like, I'm just going to skip all this. Because it's not particular, like the story is not super full of plot. Like there's a plot, but it's not, you know, it's a lot of character moments more than plot. So the second part is like all character moments. Like there's no real plot. So I think for people who are like, okay, I want to know what's going on, like I don't want to read this part. For those kind of people, I think they would not find it satisfying. But for people who do want to like kind of explore the characters, and if they really like that kind of, I kind of like Victorian fiction and how overwrought it is, and like they'll write long poetry about like why they love this person. You're like, okay, I think this is enough. But I kind of just really like that sort of honesty. And so I thought with Kasha and Abele, I was like, oh, I get to explore this relationship that is just so over the top. Like, you know, they're always telling each other, you know, oh, you're so wonderful, I love you so much. It's like I don't know, but I kind of enjoyed writing that part. And it was really important for Kasha's character too, because you're like, okay, he's not this silly fop guy. Like he is quite funny and charming at his best. Because in the first part, all you get is him being a total jerk to Rodan, and then in the second part, you're like, oh, this is how he is with people he loves. This is how generous he is, how loving. So it's just kind of a way of I guess people jumping to assumptions of how people are, being like, well, this is how he usually is, but this is how he became because of this horrible thing. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think that the structure was really good and surprising and quite bold because of what you said. Because the second part is basically something that people know how it ends, but at the same time, it had a specific function. On the one hand, it shows a different side to Kasha than we get to see in the first part, which is very important. And also because, well, I think that the reader can definitely forgive the writer for indulging. I'm saying it like this because, of course, the reader is happy, all the more happy to read about the relationship,
Yeah.
especially because it ends. Because otherwise, if you put it in the beginning, maybe some people would be tempted to say, okay, I got the point. These two
Mm-hmm.
guys are really in love. Yeah, that's enough. We don't need like 10 chapters to show it. But when you
Yeah.
know what happens in the end, yeah, you need 10 chapters to show it because you get this feeling of nostalgia to
Mm-hmm.
see them together, knowing what happened. So I thought that the structure helped this effect that it has on the reader. And well, the fact that the story also includes Rodan's past and his own struggles, and that we get to see a different side of him as well in the third part. That was surprising for me. I mean, I was expecting to see more of Kasha, but I really wasn't expecting to see more of Rodan. And that was a really pleasant surprise. Because, yes, like you said, maybe the story, the first part of the story is enough to tell the plot. But without the second and the third, and by the third I mean the part with Rodan's story, without those, the characters would not be as complex as they are.
Mm-hmm.
So this is exactly why I found the structure interesting, as opposed to just telling the events in a chronological order. The
Mm-hmm.
fact that the chronology was also sort of not linear,
Mm-hmm.
it did help the character building.
Yeah,
And
which
yeah,
I love
so
to do.
yeah,
My
exactly.
favorite thing in the world. I always tell
Exactly.
people I could never get into fan fiction because like making characters and building them up is like my favorite thing to do. I can just do that all day.
This is good because you manage to blend in this story fantasy, even if it is low fantasy, but fantasy with character building, which is something that is often missing from a lot of stories. Because often in fantasy there is so much focus on lore and on the world and on
Mhm.
plots that people tend to overlook characters. And it's not only in fantasy but in a lot of different genres as well, like historical fiction. That is the one that I'm more familiar with, especially if you
Mhm.
place it in, say, a medieval setting. You just feel the need to show a lot of people fighting, right? But this is
Yeah.
not what it is about.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, I think that's the greatest struggle with sci-fi, anything or
mhm,
fantasy, anything where you're building the world. It's very hard to kind of like make it natural, like introduce the world, introduce characters, and do both well enough that neither one feels like too much. And I think that yeah, that's another reason why I tend to go to low fantasy because I'm like I don't want to trust myself with the juggling of both, but also just the characters are way more interesting to me than lore. And I feel like if I wrote a story with a lot of lore, the lore would just kind of like fall away and people would be like, what is this? Like, I don't know what you're talking about. So I'm just like, I'm just going to build a world where I can mostly focus on the characters because that's what I really like to do. And not get too hung up on like a million details because I'm more of a big picture person than a super tiny detail person. So
right, exactly. That makes a lot of sense. Well, the book was finished back in 2012. That was quite a long time ago. Would you change anything about it if you were to, I don't know, to edit it or republish it or something?
yeah, I would probably cut a lot of scenes out. Because as a first draft, I'm pretty indulgent in character scenes. I don't think a lot of them are necessary, especially I think in part two, parts could be cut out because I think some of them are repetitive. Like, okay, we get it. So I think that would definitely does need to be cut a lot because it's very long. um, there's also parts of Kasha's history that I'm like, I don't know if this is super, like it's a little violent, and I'm like, I don't know if it would change much if I were to make it less violent. Um, because yeah, I'm like always indulge like the darker parts of things, and I'm like, I don't need to go this dark all the time. So but I think the part one and part three, I think I would leave a lot of that in because I do, especially like Rodan's story and that sort of thing. I do think that's pretty relevant. Um, and I have thought about, I'm like, maybe the ending was a little bit too bittersweet. Maybe make it not as sad. I mean, it is kind of happy, but it's also kind of sad. And I'm like, I could make it a little less sad. I don't know. I mean, I know people get really mad about non-happy endings, which I'm not particularly against unhappy endings. But I do understand the frustration in people who are like, I read this to get away and now I'm sad. I'm like, yeah, I don't want to make anyone sad. So I don't know if I would like tweak some stuff. Because I think in 2012, I would like go dark real fast. Like doesn't need to be that much. Like these days, I think when I create, I'm a little less. So maybe it's because I'm more influenced by people online, always being like, this doesn't need to be this like violent or whatever. I'm like, people write crazy violent stuff all the time, and it's not a big deal. Like fantasy, you can kind of just do whatever. I mean, like horror movies exist, right? Like people get violently murdered all the time. So, but yeah, I might smooth over some of the stuff and yeah, toss out a significant portion or at least like integrate some of those scenes into other scenes. Like what was it? Why was it? What was the point of this scene? And can I take the point of that and stuff it into another scene? Like you might like learn a fact about somebody and I'm like, okay, you could take that and put that somewhere else. Because there's this whole thing where like he goes down to the coast, Kasha goes down to the coast and buys this horse for Abele. And it's really important that he buys the horse for him because the horse is like very symbolic. And he gets like super upset about Rodan, who's like just escaped, and he's like, I'm just gonna steal this horse. This is just this random horse, and it's like the horse that Abele had, and Kasha gets so mad and so upset and has like a breakdown over this horse. So the horse is really important. I don't know if all the stuff that happens around the horse is important. So all we really need to know is he went down there, he got this horse, and he brought it back, and he paid lots of money for it. So yeah, there's definitely parts I would cut, but I think I'd keep the same formatting, like the first part, second part, third part. Because I do there in that time period too, I was like being really experimental with non-chronological stuff, like to the point where it's like, okay, you need to stop, you need to chill out. But I do think in this book it does really serve a purpose, and it kind of tells the story in the least depressing way. Because yeah, I don't think there's a way that you could write the second part first and have people read and not put it down after the end of that part, because they'd be like, no. Plus, it's like the whole point is it's Kasha and Rodan, and they're not even mentioned in the second part. So, yeah.
Yes, I see. I see. Yeah, I know what you mean, and I know what you mean about the ending, but we're not going to give spoilers right now. So
Yeah.
yes, but well, I love the ending, and I found it all very well. Everything had its function, even the dark parts. So, but yes, I totally see what you mean. I also often find myself too indulgent about the dark parts, but I'm not indulgent about the good parts. So this is one of the things I'm trying to work when I write. So yeah, I know what you mean. We
Yeah.
all have our this kind of tendencies one way or another.
Yeah. I think I listen too much to people online. I'm like, I should just follow my truth and just go with it. And I think people are a lot less judgmental than you think they're going to be if you do it right. But I also am like always hearing people being like, less dark, less dark, less dark. And I'm like, I understand why, but at the same time, there are people who really like to read dark stories. I like to read overwrought emotional drama. And you can't get that if it's just like, oh, you stole my bagel, or like stuff like that. Like you're not gonna get those like characters breaking down, falling apart, sobbing in public. Like that's the kind of stuff that I live for, and you have to create situations that create those character moments, and you can't do it with like very mild drama. So, and also like my fantasy always tends to be darker than my contemporary is just kind of like, here's a fun story, some dark elements, but it's mostly a fun romp. And my fantasy stories are just like, okay, we're gonna roll out all my issues, and we're gonna get a magnifying glass. And we're gonna get real close and figure this stuff out. So yeah, I definitely have different approaches depending on the theme, or if it's contemporary versus fantasy.
Exactly. I was just going to ask you that if it is just the fantasy world, which is also sort of based on uh, real world in the past, and that does it also imprint a darker mood, or is it just contemporary? But yes, you said it's well, your contemporary stuff isn't as dark, mostly because of
Mhm.
course our world is much easier than it used to be. So
Yeah.
um, well, so perhaps we're going to talk about your contemporary fiction as well in a future episode.
Yeah, maybe.
All right,
That's
thank
a
you
lot
so
less
much.
structure.
Yes, yes. Well, Wanda, thank you so much for our conversation today. It was really interesting, and we're hoping to see you again.
All right, cool.
All right,
Thanks.
goodbye, everyone.
All right, thank you.